Hello and welcome to Unfrozen. I'm Dan Safarik.
And I'm Greg Lindsay, and welcome to episode 104 Make Gaza Great Again. There's no guest this week. We debated trying to have one, but it was difficult to find someone who could really cover the complete angles of this story, which is still unfolding. And this week's episode, as the title implies, is devoted to plans for Gaza's reconstruction that was reported, well, a number of places, and we'll unpack this and go back into it. But it was most recently reported by the Washington Post, which obtained a 38 slide deck for the GREAT Trust, where GREAT in this case stands for Gaza Reconstitution, Economic Acceleration, and Transformation. Within these 38 slides is a rationale and plan laid out to basically ethnically cleanse Gaza, those who remain, with some forms of tokenized compensation, as we'll talk about, but also contains a number of images and plans for what the reconstruction of Gaza will entail. And so we're going to spend a bit today talking a bit about the backstory of this, which we've been following for months and years, as we'll discuss, but also what it says about, of course, architecture, the profession, and the fact that, yes, that the reconstruction of Gaza has been more influenced by an AI TikTok video of the so-called Gaza Riviera that was published earlier this year, and now, of course, this deck. Dan, where shall we dive in? Because there's a lot to cover.
There's so many angles on this. I think I guess the most important thing to know is who came up with this, and who is involved, and who is just nominally involved because their logos were thrown in. Because I think that's an important distinction. I you know before we get to before we start filming the our version of the Scarlett Johansson complicit video from a few years ago, where she was satirizing, Ivanka Trump, we should be clear that this appears to have originated between a group of Israeli businessmen and a couple of rogue consultants at Boston Consulting Group, with some help from higher ups, no question. But there's a lot of logos in here with familiar names of commercial and construction companies and architecture design companies that, as far as we know, were put in without their knowledge. So I guess we'll start with the who.
Yes, let's start with the who. So the backstory, as far as I can tell, begins actually well over a year ago when a 9 slide deck circulated in Hebrew with many of the images that appear in the new Great deck. Um, Others commented on this. Kate Wagner flagged it at the time, I believe. I actually used those slide images to talk to various groups, including architecture firms like Gensler and Smith Group, to show off the fact that this AI slop is what's coming out of supposedly the Israeli Prime Minister's office. As it turns out, the truth of it is, and you can see in both decks, their initials is this is the product of a Israeli American venture capitalist named Michael Eisenberg, ME in the doc, and Liren Tankman, an Israeli technology entrepreneur and former military intelligence officer. These are both according to the Washington Post, who I believe was the first to name it. So their initials are there, along with a third unidentified figure named TF. Before we get into the details of the plan, it's also worth noting that yes, this was circulated here. The Financial Times was the one earlier this year in June, July, before this, that started picking up the various smoke signals coming out of this. That effectively these two gentlemen and others were also involved with the Gaza Humanitarian Fund (GHF). Sorry, Gaza Humanitarian Foundation (GHF), which is extremely controversial. It has been frankly denounced by many human aid practitioners here, given that it uses private security forces to guard its various sites, given the violence that has happened around GHF. But interestingly enough here is that GHF has direct links to the two gentlemen in question, and then also to, and this is where we'll get a little circumspect here, former partners at the Boston Consulting Group, as Dan mentioned, who or the firm in July reported that yes, that BCG had been the ones responsible for doing the financial modeling in the report, which we'll get to in a moment. BCG's response was evidently to fire the partners in question, claiming in responses to questions from FT and other journalists that they had presented this work internally. They had been told to stop. Evidently, they continued the work, and that BCG had effectively terminated them for cause and disavowed the work, and is still continuing to disavow the work. So yeah, it's an interesting question. And then also the FT also reported, and we'll get into the plan itself, that the Tony Blair Institute was partners in this. TBI basically sort of denied that they were active planners in this, but that they were responding to various proposals put forth. They were offering comments on this. They participated in calls. It remains to be seen here. It is just interesting. I will note that at about the time this plan is being reported by the Washington Post, evidently both Tony Blair and Jared Kushner were back in the White House for meetings about post Gaza reconstruction and what it would mean. So, plans are coming together, Dan. Shall we get into the details of the plan itself, or anything you want to comment on this tricky web? We'll see if we can put in the show notes here links to all the reporting here that draws these figures together through Gaza Humanitarian Fund, through Boston Consulting's defense practice, former BCG people who started defense firms that worked for the fund, that is involved in the deck. It's a tangled web we weave, you might say.
Yeah, I think the most remarkable thing for me is just really just how shitty graphically this whole thing is. Considering all the wealth and power that it's supposed to connote, and all the you know uh, implied assent of heads of state, whose several of whose names appear on future roadways. I guess we can talk about
Oh yes.
kind of the master plan. Basically, the idea is to create something called an Abrahamic gateway. The idea being that this would be a logistics hub. It would, of course, be, leveraging AI with regional data centers. And I think this has been alluded to before this whole story broke, but, in his way, as he always does, Trump is talking, musing aloud about things that he probably shouldn't. But he's been talking about, oh, it'd be great real estate development, you know. So of course, going in from the ocean to the border with current border with Israel, you've got the Trump resorts naturally on the waterfront. Then you've got a ring road named after Mohammed bin Salman, the current leader of Saudi Arabia.
The Crown
There,
Prince.
sorry, the Crown Prince, the nominal, well, whatever, MBS. And then
Yep.
you've got MBZ, who is the leader of UAE. He's got a roadway named after him. And then, of course, there is an Elon Musk smart manufacturing zone. So it's like a totally branded development named after all of our favorite people who are operators or would be operators in the region, which is really remarkable. Um, so there's a lot of master planning. Typical dots and lines and dotted lines. But there's also some really incredibly shitty renderings. My favorite one is the one that shows the advanced manufacturing example of an electric vehicle industrial zone, which is foregrounded such that the denizens of this zone, who are all clad in traditional Middle Eastern garb, appear to be approximately 9 feet tall. And then the building that they're looking at is probably about 6 feet tall, and then behind is a cut and paste generic skyline of like every you know sort of AI generated. I don't even think it's AI generated. These look like shitty CGI from 2008. I can see like simulacra of like the KFD tower in Riyadh, and a bunch of other stuff that doesn't really exist but looks a lot like stuff that does. Just cut and paste kind of into the background. Like the scale is completely off. And so the most dominant thing in the whole picture really is, this parking lot with a bunch of really undersized cars. They look like they were driven by the Shriners. Like all the proportions are off. I can't even. I really need Kate Wagner in
It's
here to kind of like
it's
grok this with me.
It's AI slop. What can we tell you? We'll
It's
post
incredible.
this. We'll post the complete PDF here. The Washington Post was the first to publish the PDF for open download. The FT obviously saw this and created some of its own versions of the maps and things. But before we get into the ethnic cleansing part, which is I think obviously the most distressing for various reasons, let's further discuss the urban planning of this because so much to say here. First, to your point there about the Gaza Riviera, it is interesting here. The doc lists world-class resorts along the coastline and on small artificial islands, similar to the Palm Islands in Dubai. Interestingly enough, the Trump organization, prior to the global financial crisis, was going to open a Trump hotel on the Palm, and I actually interviewed Don Trump Jr. in the Trump Tower in New York about their plans to do so. So, as with everything with the Trumps, like echoes and foreshadowing that just goes back decades and decades. But it's really slide 7 there where we need to talk, which is Gaza's urban design fostering stability and quality of life. Uh, where to begin? We'll start with the text real fast because it opens with a reference to Baron von Haussmann. Like Haussmann's strategy in 19th century Paris, it reads, this plan aims to address one of Gaza's ongoing insurgency's root causes, its urban design. I should note here, of course, that the subtitle of the entire document is From a Demolished Iranian Proxy to a Prosperous Abrahamic Ally. So there is a lot of discussion here about isolating Iran, basically rebuilding it to diminish Hamas. And yes, the fact that they're starting from the idea that we're going to basically tear out the entire urban fabric so that no one can ever build a barricade or hide in it. That's evidently it. But what they replace it with is fascinating. It's two images. One is a sort of really generic SimCity style on the right that sends chills up and down my spine because it's the kind of low resolution, hyper stylized graphic that I have been seeing models of for 20 years as the author of Eretropolis. This is exactly the kind of resolution of those kinds of plans. It's not out of place for a schematic document of this type. But the really crazy one is the diagram on the left, which imagines 6 pie shaped cities powered by AI. All services and economy in these cities will be done through ID based AI powered digital systems. Let's be honest, kids, we're talking full biometrics and facial recognition surveillance of everybody in these cities. But 6 pie shaped cities that have a freeway running through the middle, the Riviera on one side, the manufacturing zone on the other, and then nominally green space in between. I don't know, Dan. This is like Ebenezer Howard's Garden Cities on consultant speak, I suppose, but just absolutely crazy in terms of how stylized and unrealistic and where it was left. But that is exactly the problem with this, as we'll discuss.
Yeah, I mean, I think, if you really believe that you're going to have a tabula rasa or tabula Gaza, as the case may be, you can do things like this. You can imagineer it into existence if you think you have enough buy-in. And I don't know that they ever got that far. I mean, that's what's sort of not clear. It's like who has heard this pitch and who has responded to it? And I mean, we know Tony Blair was consulted as a third party, you know, hands clean part, a witness, as they like to put it. But I'm just wondering, how much has this been shopped around? Because my understanding is that, as mentioned earlier, you know, this seems to come from the imagination of just a few people. I'm just not clear how many people have been consulted in all of this.
But that's exactly the point. Let's take a pause here. This is the reason I'm obsessed with this document is because it is the apotheosis of something that I've been screaming about to architects for years and years, which is if you do not position yourself upstream of these proposals, offer better proposals, not just act on the brief, then yeah, you'll be subject to these kinds of briefs. Like you need to take control of better futures of this. And again, we haven't even covered the most distressing parts of this whole thing here. But the fact that this is a plan that might have been presented in the White House, that the client might be at the highest levels of the Israeli government, as originally implied, is just is terrifying because these are the people who are defining the agenda, and it's not actually any of the architects or planners who will be perhaps recruited at some point to act on it. This is something that I remember, getting into a fight with Tom Bain himself about, as I think listeners have heard. It's something that I've talked about with AECOM, whose name is in this deck, as we will discuss, where, standing on stage that, 10 years ago, talking about the fact that they're the only firm large enough that could implement this kind of scale and integration of this, that they need to come up with better plans. Well, yeah, please help. Or please don't do it, as we should get into with this.
Yeah.
But to say the least. But this is what happens. And the final note on this, on the architecture and urbanization of it is that yes, this is the outcome of what happens when these consulting practices. And I don't know if this is one of BCG's slides or not, but I can say based on personal experience that yes, that there is a lack of this kind of capability inside of the consultancies, and this is what they'll produce. I like to believe that the answer is to fight fire with fire. That basically, that architecture and planning firms need to bring in economic planning and projections and be able to offer something better. But yes, should we continue down into the heart of darkness, Dan?
Yes, indeed. So maybe the governance framework is where we begin with that.
Ah, yes.
A custodianship. I'm trying to think of an existing political entity that is actually considered a custodianship. I can't really think of one. I mean, there's protectorates, right? But That's not exactly what they're proposing here.
Well, again, the closest to this is, and again, why I'm like this burns to me like a something like fire ants, is that the closest to that is Paul Romer's concept of charter cities, which he proposed 15 years ago, which I wrote
Totally.
about in 2012, which we've covered here in the past. And so much of this, by the way, fits into the framework of, I believe, episode 92 with the Atusa Abrahamian and her book, The Hidden Globe. It should be self evident here that this would be a special economic zone that would have all sorts of various carve outs. And again, we have this trust, supposedly not self determination for the Palestinians in Gaza, but
Oh,
not
heck
even
no.
not even a avowed nation state here, but the Great Trust. Please continue, Dan. Like, what would this even look like?
Okay. Well, they've got a whole plan, that shows what looks like it's about 5 or 6 year plan. No, I think 10. I think they cover 10 total years. First 6 to 12 months, easy peasy. Israel fights to dismantle Hamas. Asterisk. This phase could be skipped if Hamas agrees to disarm voluntarily. So, you
Truly
know,
amazing bit of consulting speak there. Yeah.
amazing. Thank you. I'm so glad that's skippable. Let's go on to year one. Transfer of administrative responsibilities. The Great Trust is created. GHF folds under the Great Trust. This is that Gaza Humanitarian Foundation that is basically a militarized, supposedly aid delivery operation, which has already been condemned widely. And then Israel maintains overarching rights to meet its security needs, whatever that means. Uh, Multilateral custodianship happens during the transition period, so the trust will govern Gaza for a transition period until a reformed and de-radicalized Palestinian polity is ready to step in its shoes. Okay. And who makes that determination? I don't know. How does that happen? Doesn't say. But the end state is self-governance under the Abraham Accords. So protections will remain in place to secure the trust's assets and ensure long-term stability, which doesn't exactly sound like a free people choosing their leadership freely. But potentially, Gaza will sign a Compact of Free Association, COFA, with the trust for long-term financial support in exchange for the trust retaining some plenary powers, undefined. And they will then the reformed Palestinian polity will join the Abraham Accords. So that's the plan. That's how you transition from a custodianship to a polity. Nowhere in here does the word country come up or state.
Yes, indeed. Yes, well, there's that. That is very consciously missing. And then I think the real part that has really alarmed people justifiably here is, we'll say it's on slide 15, which is basically tokenized ethnic cleansing, for lack of a
Oh
better
yeah.
word here. So in this case, and God bless the BCG folks modeled this out. This is the stats in here are also reported by the Financial Times here. Yeah, it's either basically two choices. Either there's temporary housing that's built, and most of the Gazans remain, but it's evidently done somehow systematically here to cover it. Or you give everyone $5,000 to relocate, subsidize rent for 4 years, subsidize food for 1 year, and that, yeah, that basically assumes that of the 25% of Gazans who leave the country, 75% of those choose not to return to Gaza. The reason you would do all this, not because you want to basically annex the whole state, is because it would save $23,000 per Palestinian to relocate them where it's never said, and that for every 1% of Gazans who relocate, the project would save $500 million. They're doing this to just streamline things, Dan. We're just trying to give people a deal. It's universal basic income. That is apparently how they're spinning this. No, folks,
Uh-huh.
it's ethnic cleansing. And worse, it's not even the cash, because I can't find the slide here, but part of it was to basically tokenize it here. It was to, of course, because you would take all the public land in Gaza, you would put that in the trust, and then people could put their private property into the trust and get basically, shares out of it to some extent here. Of course, you would lose your family's private land, but hey, that's what you would get. And then private public, entities would come invest in it. The last half dozen slides here are, things like $97 billion expected in trust investments in the first 10 years, and all sort of modeled out here. And, $36 billion from the private industry here for building out, the broadband and the permanent housing, advanced manufacturing, lots of advanced manufacturing. We can go on and on here, but yes, I think people have appropriately recoiled in horror here. This is effectively we're going to buy people, we're going to buy off the Palestinians, maybe somehow, And then a Gaza Riviera happens with the help of all these brand name companies, which I'm scared to even say their names out loud for for threat of libel lawsuits. But yes, Dan, thoughts?
Oh my God. So yeah, reconstruction will increase the value of Gaza from zero. It is currently valued at zero, by the way, for those who are interested. But it will increase the value by 324 billion and dramatically improve quality of life. So, problem solved. And isn't it also said somewhere in here that they're planning to pay people in Bitcoin?
Yes, I'm struggling to find the token. Where is the token version of this one here too? Because I don't believe it was that, but it was this idea of creating that. Yes, built on a land trust and tokenization. Yes, it is here on slide 9. We skipped over it here, but that was going to be the whole idea here. Was is to basically there was a whole blockchain play as well here too. And so you would convert your assets, your real estate assets into digital ones, and these tokens would basically give you right to fractional ownership here. So, yeah, what does a rug pull look like on the Gazan land registry is not something I ever want to find out, to say the least.
Good Lord. I mean, yeah, and of course, I think it goes without saying that the humanitarian impact of this is just execrable, but I still just I can't quite I can't quite get my head around it. The idea that they think that this is going to be viable and accepted. Oh, and at no cost to taxpayers.
Of course.
It's all private investment. You know, Hamas will voluntarily dissolve itself because this is such a great idea, or they're just putting aside the like, oh yeah, after Israel takes care of Hamas. It's not even included in the calculus. Like,
Well, there is 13 billion earmarked for Gaza security, and as a slide on page 22, it
okay,
does have the most logos of a great number of effectively mercenary groups in here,
right.
and including, I will just say too, that's mentioned repeatedly in the doc as Western PCS and TCN, which I am uncertain if they're already providing work with GHF. But they are repeatedly here mentioned by name as opposed to just their logos slapped up there. But yes, obviously the security piece of this, including descriptions of all the weaponry they'll need, is a big piece of the plan.
Right.
But to me, I guess more broadly speaking of this, it's a horror show all the way down, people. But what's fascinating to me is in two respects. One, we talked earlier, of course, about the fact that this plan might just be dumped into the lap of an architecture firm at some point, or let's just say, let's use this as an example. AECOM is mentioned on multiple slides in education and workforce development. It's mentioned on the public-private partnership investments. It's again, AECOM, we give you all the credit here that this is a logos they yanked and threw up here. We know, for example, there's been statements that Dan, the architect, the Bosco Vertical in Milan, which is seen on one of the slides here for housing, the architect in question. Yes, Boleri has already formally acknowledged that they had nothing to do with this. They've already received inquiries from journalists. I don't know about the other companies here. But here you go. This is such an apotheosis of like the kind of, number one, the architects left out of this completely, plans formulated above them and dropped down. But also number two, this is the apotheosis of the consulting model, the fact that this is being put together by a team of youngish associates at the behest of BCG partners who have since been relieved of their duties, and constructed this way. All these neat ideas that are just put into the deck and presented as a fait accompli. And then the other thing that stands out is also like this is hopefully the apotheosis of the Dubai model. Can we get more Dubai than this in terms of the zone strategy that Atusa has laid out for us in past episodes, and the idea of these kinds of infrastructure developments, and will attract in foreign talent and re-educate. It's really like I don't know. Can you make it more concentrated than this? It doesn't seem like you can.
If I wrote a novel depicting all this stuff, people would say, no, that's ridiculous. That's too on the nose. Like, people aren't that transparently cynical. And it's like, oh, yes, they are.
Well, the other interesting thing about that is we mentioned we can't put it in a novel. Is we do have, yes, we do have this points of comparison here between the first deck, or at least one version of it, iterating in Hebrew from 2024, and the contemporary one, and both decks talk a bit about, I can see here, this idea of IMEC, number one. It's also interesting, the sort of bigger picture of this. We talked about Abrahamic corridor, right? The idea that these, we're going to bring together Israel, this other Gaza-like entity, this trust, and potentially the Saudis here who are shown in various decks here, into the sort of new Abrahamic tent under the Accords. But there is this proposal that came up at the G20 called IMEC, which is like the India Middle East corridor. So like the grand strategic play here is like, how do you create new sets of pipelines and ports here to basically route around the sort of Russia-China axis? So the geopolitics are in play. But it is interesting here that like many of the things that you talked about, these features are all new in the past year, and part of me has just got to think, Dan, that TikTok video of AI rendering a Gaza Riviera, including a gold statue of Trump, that the president then, of course, enthusiastically retweeted and talked about. Well, here it all is, like this is not done at the, by some outside actors. It was done at the behest of the president, some of the most powerful people, on a TikTok video rendered by AI. Way is like even more than the Gaza Riviera video, which is there too. Is like this really is an offshoot of the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, and sort of offshoot sense of like, well, once you've created a sort of security apparatus, well, then why don't you just build some cities around it too? Which is another thing. Like this is not coming from any official economic development agencies, even state agencies of the various partners. Like this is not coming from an Israeli agency, which, by the way, early on, like the claims of this document here that that you'd ask people to voluntarily ethnic cleanse, there were leaked documents early on, post October 7th, 2023, by various Israeli think tanks that said very openly, like, yes, our job is to come up with scenarios, and of course we're modeling out what the removal of Gazan citizens would look like. But this is a fascinating one because it's entrepreneurial. It's a freelance proposal that's pulling in, that got some funding to do Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, that had connections, and now trying to spin this into an ever larger thing. It's remarkable, to
Yeah,
say the least.
yeah. I mean, I will be pondering this for weeks, and hopefully, more information will come out. I imagine the disavowals will come next. Like, we knew nothing of this. This is a rogue project.
I would like to see, at least from the firms quoted in this, whose images are in this document, to have them say publicly on the record, we would never participate in this. Attention drifts elsewhere, but like, again, not to get any libel here, but like there's still like some brand name luxury hotel groups. There's some leading tech companies, some affiliated with the president, some not.
Modular
Some
construction, modular furniture, names you will know.
Yes, very some famous retailers in here, which I imagine are not all that happy about it, nor would they participate. But it is interesting. You just sort of pull this deck together and present it out here as like, of course they'll be part of it. Well, it'll be interesting to see if there's any real pushback on that. I'm actually shocked that BCG asked the partners who worked on this to step down to leave the firm, because my understanding of it is, having talked to former principals inside of these firms, is they are as unethical as the most unethical partner in the firm. The partners are truly independent, and if they can find younger associates to staff their projects, they'll do projects for the devil himself if it comes to that, if they choose to. And so in this case, to have the work disavowed is fascinating. Obviously, that's because they were told internally not to do it. Be curious to know those internal checks. And obviously, BCG is also demoted. Their former chief global risk officer, who apparently is taking the fall for this. So, well, it will be bracing to see. Well, number one, if this plan even remotely begins to come to fruition, let's hope it doesn't. Number one, for the outset, and then number two, we'll be very curious to see which firms will feel compelled for whatever reason to participate in this. Because some will, because your point there, like not just the smaller firms are hand to mouth, but then the public firms have fiduciary responsibilities to the shareholders and need to keep earnings up. So the big ones, of course, are going to go for this, particularly given this the scale of engineering contracts and infrastructure versus architectural design. So the really big integrated firms will have to play in the way that almost all of them, big names, have played in the construction of NEOM so far and its core infrastructure. But yes, I don't know if it's a function of outcry. I don't know if it's a function of like we can muster shame at this point. But I would hope that we would see a full disavowal, at least to the mentions of this. And and of course, this bracing. We'll wrap this up in a second. But it's worth noting that the United Nations number one in April estimated that 92% of all the residential buildings in Gaza has already been destroyed. And so I think let's just say that the projections here of how long it would take to clear the rubble might be blithe. And then second, I think also to quote the UN, is their special rapporteur for Gaza, in June and July issued basically a communique here, a report titled "From Economy of Occupation to Economy of Genocide," and listed out many of the private firms that are actively involved in the ongoing conflict and the ongoing invasion of Gaza by Israeli defense forces. So it'll be very interesting. I did not have a chance to, before this podcast taping, to like go through it with a fine-tooth comb to see all the various names, because there are many in here. Maybe a quick search of some of them will yield anything. No. No, two of the names that are in the doc are not in this special report, so I won't name them there. But yes, that report is already bracing in the number of firms that, of course, that have advanced manufacturing facilities there and how they are complicit in this. So let's hope that members of our field don't get involved. But I know, Dan, any final thoughts of this? It's obviously like a sad and distressing thing of this. It's like, I feel like this is like the final outcome of this entire thing where architects have no control over their own projects or clients, and that you have to have hat in hand, and then something like this comes along, a true Faustian bargain to say the least. All right. Well, on that note, we'll leave it here. There's not much else we can add from here. And we're right. We'll see what further reporting comes out of this. But yeah, with the presence of actual deck slides, it felt necessary to talk about this. And again, that the urban planning or lack thereof, I think again underscores the real problem we have here, which is the people who have agency in this and have funding and have connections don't. I mean, on top of everything horrible that's in this document, have no faith or belief in the design of the built environment, or that it even matters, merits a mention beyond a single slide with basically crudely drawn diagrams. That should give us all room for thought, something to think about here as we think about how do we basically steer potential clients to better outcomes. Thanks, listeners.